On March 12, 1977, Rutilio Grande, a 42-year-old Salvadoran Jesuit priest, was assassinated on his way to Mass by a right-wing, government-sanctioned death squad. Murdered alongside him were Manuel Solórzano, his 72-year-old sacristan and bodyguard, and Nelson Rutilio Lemos, a 15-year-old boy they picked up on their way to Mass. But until now, their martyrdom has not received much coverage or garnered the same fame as Archbishop Óscar Romero, who was killed almost 3 years later in the same bloody civil war, a war that took the lives of at least 75,000 civilians, a war that wrought devastation that is so far-reaching that the country is still reeling from it and struggling to recover. But who was Rutilio Grande? And why did he pose a threat so great to the government that he became the first priest martyr of this savage war? Who and what were he and those who rallied around him fighting for? And where was the Catholic Church amid all this? Stay with us. Good day and welcome to Behind the Story. I'm Ricardo da Silva, a Jesuit priest and associate editor at America Media. Joining us today on Behind the Story from California is Sister Ana Maria Pineda. Ana Maria is a member of the Institute of the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. In her professional role, she is an associate professor in the Religious Studies Department at Santa Clara University. She is also the author of 2 books about the martyr priest. Her latest title, Rutilio Grande, Memory and Legacy of a Jesuit Martyr, is from Lexio Publishing and is about to hit our bookstores. She is also a distant relative of Father Grande. Joining us from Spain is Joaquin Chavez. Joaquin is an associate professor of history at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He is a historian of Latin America with a particular focus on intellectuals, revolutionary movements, and Catholicism in El Salvador. He is also the author of Poets and Prophets of the Resistance, Intellectuals and the Origins of El Salvador's Civil War. So it's good morning to Ana Maria and a good evening to Joaquin. Welcome to the both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This Saturday, Pope Francis will beatify Rutilio, Manuel, and Nelson, and also Father Cosma Spessotto, who was an Italian Franciscan monk who ministered in El Salvador, and he too was murdered just 3 months after Archbishop Óscar Romero. As Salvadoran citizens yourselves, what does it feel like to know that one of yours is about to be beatified?
Well, I think about it, and as soon as I do, I'm moved to tears to see that one of our own, from very, very humble beginnings, is being acknowledged for a life of service and love for his people, for God, and for those that he was really concerned about. And a moment of great witness for all of us, not only in El Salvador, but beyond that little country.
And Joaquin, what does this mean for you?
So, to me, it's also very personal in the sense that I attended the Mass in honor of Rutilio that Monsignor Romero performed at the National Cathedral as a member of the Catholic community, but also as a student at a high school in San Salvador. We were basically invited to attend, and I think it was one of the most moving experiences perhaps in my life. The fact that a Catholic priest and these 2 his friends were brutally murdered, right, by the people close to the government, as it turned out.
Mm. You know, I was in El Salvador myself at the beginning of 2017 and visited El Paisnal as part of my own Jesuit formation in preparation for priesthood. The thing that strikes me is we so often see history as a collection of dates, right? And that for me is daunting. And we fail to put figures and stories and narratives to history, remembering that there are people behind all these dates, behind all these facts. And so maybe that's a good place for us to begin, or at least it would be a good place for me to begin. Won't you tell me, Ana Maria, who was Rutilio Grande? Like, let's go back to, where he was born.
Rutilio Grande was born, as you already mentioned, in El Paisnal, a very poor part of El Salvador. And as a young boy, he really suffered, I think, the poverty that surrounded that reality, and had older brothers. He was the youngest. As part of the family story, his parents at a very early age separated. He was like 4 or 5 years old. And the father left for Honduras. The mother, it is said, died maybe about a year later. So his paternal grandmother was there with them and helped raise them. And she often went to the little church of St. Joseph, San Jose, and did this kind of sacristan work in the church, and he would go with her. So from that early age, I believe that he had a great connection to God and to the church and to liturgy.
You also mentioned, in our conversations before this, you mentioned that he played priest, right?
Yes, that's a beautiful little story. So Rutilio decided that he was going to celebrate Mass, and so he would recruit his cousins and brothers and friends to be the altar boys, but he would be the priest and he would say Mass. And there's a kind of a tree that gives like a little seed that's round. So he would use those seeds for the host. And he had a bell. And my cousin actually still has it. And this bell must have been borrowed or given on behalf of the church in the town. And his collaborators would ring the bells when the host was elevated. And then everybody in town would say, "Oh, es la misa de Rutilio. That's Rutilio's Mass." So it was very well known in the little town that was what the little boy Rutilio was doing.
So this desire for priesthood is a young desire. How does it kind of develop from there?
From early on, it seems like he desires to be a priest. But given the context of his reality, that was such an impossible dream. I mean, he barely was able to go to school in El Paisnal. But when he's around 13 years old, the youngest Archbishop of El Salvador, Chavez y Gonzalez, he's like 39 years old, comes to El Paisnal on one of those visits. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Rutilio accompanied him because he was very familiar with what happened in the church because of his grandmother. And in that visit, they enter into a little like father and son relationship. And after he's left, Archbishop Chavez y Gonzalez, Rutilio writes him a sweet letter, kind of expressing his desire to become a priest. And from that moment on, the Archbishop plays a very significant role in making it possible for him to pursue his dream of priesthood. He supports him along the way. He tries to figure out how it's possible. And that's how Rutilio comes to the San Jose de la Montaña seminary at the age of 13.
So he's formed at the seminary in San Salvador, correct? And
yes,
where to from there?
He is sent to Panama, and this is a very significant part of his story. He's in Panama, moving on in Jesuit formation, and the story is said, or is told, that one morning they find him kind of in a catatonic state. He can't respond to people. It's like he doesn't know where he is. And the Jesuits, of course, don't know what to do. And they're concerned. He's a young man, a young boy, a young man. And they try and find medical treatment for him in the country in Latin America, but were not able to. And then decide just to keep him there in Panama. So after some care and love and concern on behalf of the Jesuits, he comes out of it. But forever after that, he suffers from bouts of depression and self-doubt and has a very fragile nervous system. This is, to me, the part of this beautiful man that he comes out of this wounded self into the person that we're going to celebrate as blessed. After Panama, he pursues further studies, but he's also sent to the seminary, San Jose de la Montaña, a few times. And at one point, he's involved in formation work at the seminary. I think the part that's probably very beautiful about that is that At that point in time, most of the Jesuits there were from Spain or outside of the country, but few were Salvadoreños, and Rutilio was a Salvadoreño. So he comes after having studied at Celam, which was one of the leading catechetical centers in the country at the time, and comes with this wonderful idea of renovation and finding new ways of doing formation, making sure that the young men that were going to be trained as priests really understood the realities of the people that they were going to encounter. So he has them go out to surrounding towns and enter into what today we know as the see, judge, and act process. They were to see the reality, they were to listen to what the people had to say, and building on that, then they would respond. And after being at the seminary, unfortunately, his wonderful, creative, innovative Second Vatican Council ideas don't sit well with all the bishops, so he's dismissed. Mm-hmm. And he goes to IPLA, Latin American Pastoral Institute. And this was a meeting place of all the Latin American thinkers, what to do in today's context of the world, and on the heels of the Second Vatican Council. And it's there where Rutilio believes, in communication with his Jesuit superiors, that there's something new that needs to be done for the church and for the people, and especially the poor. And from that comes the innovative teamwork that is begun in Aguilares, not too far from El Paisnal, which was his hometown. And he does what they call una opción primaria, a fundamental option for the rural poor.
I want to bring in Joaquin now, because you've mentioned a number of things that I think are really important, but that we need to give some context for, because most of our English-speaking audience is unlikely to understand exactly what was going on. So maybe, Joaquin, could you paint a picture for us of this time, and maybe even just before that? What was going on in El Salvador that inspired in Rutilio this fundamental option for the rural poor?
Yeah, fundamentally, the context of the 1970s is a context in which the military governments of the period basically intensify coercion, repression against especially the rural poor, especially in areas like Aguilares, where the new Catholic theology was being developed, perhaps being translated into more pedagogical forms. So that kind of pastoral activity, right, was taking place in areas like Aguilares or San Vicente, Chalatenango, areas of the country, where we're seen with tremendous suspicion by the state, by the military government. And so communities such as communities in Aguilares, in these other places, were subject to constant surveillance, harassment, and eventually outright violence, right? Mm-hmm. So the larger context of the period is a context in which the military government is ruling the country practically illegally, because there are two presidential elections have been rigged. Then in 1977, right before the events that we're discussing tonight happened, in February of 1977, not only another electoral fraud was committed at the presidential level, again by the military government, the official party, but this time security forces actually massacred protesters in downtown San Salvador on February 28, 1977. This is a very famous event that took place in downtown San Salvador, where there was open violence, right, against legal opposition parties like the Christian Democrat Party or other parties in the opposition. And of course, open hostility of the state against the Catholic Church. And this hostility have started much earlier, right, in perhaps the mid-60s, in the context of the theological changes that were taking place after Vatican II and Medellin and so forth, and all of the reforms that were taking place in the church in the context of Vatican II. And it is basically the period of Monsignor Chavez y Gonzalez, where he became the big reformer of the church in this period. And then in the 70s, the violence against, I might say, Catholics who have taken the teachings of the Vatican II to heart, were trying to practice, right, that kind of social commitment, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can presume Vatican II, right, and the work of the Second Vatican Council, although it would be good to characterize that in this context. But I don't think we can presume Medellin. You know, what was Medellin, and how was that a response to what was going on in the broader church?
So after the Second Vatican Council, it was offering to the world a new direction, a new encounter with the church and the modern world. And the Latin American bishops, they organized themselves into a conference that took place in Medellin. And at that conference, they were trying to respond to what the Second Vatican Council had proposed and to see how they could realize the Second Vatican Council in the context of Latin America. And when they begin to do that, they have to look at the reality, and they come to a deep awareness that they're living among massive poor. There's massive poverty. And the question is, well, how can we preach a God to people who are hungry, people who are just trying to survive each day? And what is our response to it? And that is going to shape the Latin American bishops' response and how they're going to carry out the principles and of the Second Vatican Council.
Paint a picture for me. You know, we've spoken, as we often do, right, about the rural poor, the material poverty in the country. Like, paint a picture for me. What do we mean when we say this? You know, what does it look like? What are the real wages of people? What is the work of people? What is the situation of the country?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think the Salvadoran society at the time was fundamentally a rural society. Right? More than 60% of the population was rural at the time, talking about the 60s, early 70s. So fundamentally, the rural poor were people who live in dire poverty, basically without access to very basic services like education, healthcare. The rates of illiteracy were extremely high, levels of malnourishment, et cetera, et cetera. All of the social indicators were really, really terrible at the time. To make a long story short, we're talking about a society that was extremely polarized in social, economic terms. And this is something that it was also reflected in the political arena, right? Basically, more and more political polarization became a crucial characteristic of Salvadoran society, particularly after the Salvadoran-Honduran War of 1969.
Mm-hmm. And Ana Maria, are we talking about a church at this time who was on the side of the poor, or you know, or a church who was mixed and polarized as well, just as society was?
I think that the church has a very mixed history and profile. The church had sided with government and the rich traditionally in the life of El Salvador. And so the church itself was not necessarily working out of the spirit of the Second Vatican Council. And in that context, Rutilio paints a very different picture. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons that he's going to become a target for what later happens. But I also wanted to add, when I first went to visit El Paisnal, I was like 17 years old because I was raised in this country. I came when I was 2 years old. I was taken back by what I considered really poor. And I was coming from an inner city neighborhood in San Francisco, California. It was just startling to me. And today, if you go to El Paisnal, it looks beautiful. But that's because of the amount of money that's been poured into it over these many decades. And I remember my cousin telling me, and he's the Grande cousin, he said, I come to El Paisnal and sometimes it brings back very sad memories to my mind. I remember the days when we were lucky if we had a tortilla and they would sprinkle salt on the tortilla to give it some taste. And that was what we ate for the day. So the poverty was pretty stark and harsh and difficult. And that was the reality of El Paisnal, and it played across the country in so many different ways.
So, Joaquin, how does this reality then become a threat to the government at the time, such that we end up with the murder, the assassination of Rutilio Grande?
Based on my research, I think I can conclude that the Catholic pedagogical initiatives that were taking place at this very moment in different areas like El Paisnal, Aguilares, Chalatenango, San Vicente, and other places, was perceived as a fundamental threat, not only by the military government, but also by the rural elites. And by rural elites, I mean big coffee producers, sugar cane producers, cotton producers. There was a concerted pressure on the government by the elites to actually crack down on Catholic members of the Catholic community, whether priests, nuns, or lay people who were directly involved in this pastoral work or pedagogical initiatives and were seen as subversive by the military government. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish when exactly the centralized violence by the government took center stage, and some other times it was violence perpetrated directly by rural elites in particular areas, or sometimes it was a combination of both.
Yeah, it's as if we start to tell the story from the assassination of Archbishop Óscar Romero, right? And we almost forget about the kind of the 1970s and really the 1930s peasant revolt. I mean, if we go all the way back there, where the beginnings of this was, starting to fester, and really this cry among the people, surely that was blowing up.
And I'm glad you're mentioning this, Ricardo, because I think this is the big picture of the story. Because what we're seeing here in the late 70s is the collapse of the oligarchic military regime that was established right after the 1932 mass murders committed by the state in Western El Salvador. Right? So this is right after these terrible events that took place in January of 1932. Basically, the state conducted massive violence against communities that were, in principle, peaceful communities that were basically simply engaged in this kind of legal activities. Right? And eventually, obviously, these communities themselves became more radical. That happened later on, right? Became more radicalized, and some members of these communities took up arms against the state, but that is something that is taking place later on as a direct result of the violence that was perpetrated by the state.
And Maria, I said history was important, right? But I think we can also get lost in a lot of these facts. And in your book, your latest book, you've basically spent quite a bit of time talking to people who lived through this time. So could you take us to March 12, 1977, what happens, and what is the memory of that day today?
Rutilio Grande at that point in time was seeing the signs of violence that was increasing, especially with the treatment and the expulsion of Father Mario Bernal. And he feared that his teammates, who were mostly from out of the country, from El Salvador, from Spain, were going to be threatened. And so he tried to protect them. So he began to protect them by not letting them go too much beyond the parish boundary to do pastoral care. And he took it upon himself to go to El Paisnal on that day. There was going to be the feast of the parish, St. Joseph, and they had the customary novena. And on the road to El Paisnal, he's going to pass by the sugarcane fields, and he has Manuel Solórzano with him. And at some point in time, they pick up this little boy, Nelson Rutilio Lemus, who apparently may have been his godson by baptism and maybe some distant family connection. And he teases him. He says, maybe we should give you a ride home, because if you come late, your parents will be upset. Now, part of the untold story is that it's possible that they picked up 3 other little children who were walking on the road that were from El Paisnal. And on the way, they are ambushed and attacked. And at least Rutilio was at least shot by 13 different bullets. The Jeep was turned over. Manuel Solórzano was killed, and the little boy, who was epileptic, couldn't get out of the Jeep, and so he dies with them. And the 3 other children are left free to run back home to El Paisnal. Once the word gets out, they're not sure exactly what's happened. And one of my cousins tells me, he must have been like in his 20s at the time, that he actually drove by the place where his uncle had been killed, but didn't know what had occurred. And then word begins to go out. Rutilio was shot, and they begin to make known what has occurred. At some point in time, Bishop Romero comes and sees the 3 dead bodies. And the story is that he's profoundly moved to a deep silence. He can just stand there and look at these bodies. But this is the beginning of the mourning of the country, especially among the poor, of what has happened to Rutilio Grande. And in many ways, it's so appropriate, sadly appropriate, that Manuel Solórzano and this little 15-year-old boy die alongside, because that's exactly the life that Rutilio led, for the poor, for the poor, for the children. And so it's befitting that even in death, he lives out this beautiful commitment that he had.
And that the people died alongside him, right? Those very people. We have a trove of content on our website ahead of the beatification of Rutilio Grande. But one of our major pieces is this deep dive we're doing on our Inside the Vatican podcast. And as part of that, and we invite our listeners, our viewers here, to look for Inside the Vatican wherever they listen to podcasts and to listen to the deep dive. But as part of that, we interviewed this man, Antonio Rivas, who was a catequista, a delegado de la palabra, so a catechist and a delegate of the word, with Rutilio Grande in El Paisnal. And he tells this incredibly moving story. He wasn't there when on the day he was killed. One of his cousins had drowned in the Lempa River, and he was part of the rescue operation. And so he wasn't there. But upon return that evening and the next morning, the women of the village came and told them that they had heard this gunshot. And as they heard the gunshot, they rushed off to listen to where it was coming from. Long story, but they've discovered eventually where it had come from. But by the time they got there the next day, the body had been taken. The bishop had already moved the body to San Salvador, and the people were not able to mourn. The thing that struck me was this. The way Antonio described it, he said, on the 3rd day, we went looking for the body, right? There was an Easter moment there. There was a grief, a mourning, a resurrection that happened. And he said, the best way that we could live our faith, the best way that we could live out the memory of Rutilio was to live as Rutilio did, to live among the poor, to listen to the poor. So that maybe is a good story to transition us to what happened beyond that. It is said, and in fact, we know this firsthand, Pope Francis has said that Rutilio is Romero's miracle, right? That somehow Archbishop Óscar Romero was so moved by the death of his friend that it brought him to change tack the way he was approaching the church and especially the rural poor in El Salvador. I want to ask first Joaquin to maybe respond to that in terms of what he knows about Catholicism at the time, because I also know that Ana Maria has a slightly controversial or a different take on maybe the impact of Rutilio Grande on Óscar Romero.
My sense for what I have read and studied is that Monsignor Romero was profoundly moved by the killing of Rutilio, and it was probably one of the most decisive moments in Romero's tenure as Archbishop of San Salvador, in the sense that he had to take a clear and decisive position. As I said before, this is one of the most atrocious periods in human rights violations in Salvadorian history. This is a period of President Carlos Humberto Romero, no relation with Bishop Romero, where basically a military ruler who engaged in open violence virtually against members of the Catholic Church at large. I mean, there was for all we know, a systematic policy on the part of the state, right, to perpetrate this kind of violence against members of the Catholic Church who were perceived as a threat.
Ana Maria, do you have something to add? I'm sure you do.
No, I do. I want to try and express this as clearly as I can. It is true that Rutilio was a significant person in Archbishop Romero's life. There's no doubt about it. Romero, in his homily on the day of the burial, says, "He was like a brother to me, but this is not the time to talk about what he meant to me as a brother. It's a time to talk about what we have to do and think about, and what the significance is for us as Christians and as a Catholic church and community." So I'm not disagreeing with that. What I would like to perhaps bring more clarity to is that to say that Archbishop Romero is dramatically converted in that one moment of Rutilio's brutal and violent death is not giving Romero credit for his own journey of conversion. As a little boy, he goes to the parish church and kneels at the foot of the altar in front of the Blessed Sacrament and spends hours in prayer. And I've read his spiritual diaries, and you read it and you see the soul of this man. And at the death of Rutilio, it's hard not to be moved by the violence of it. And I think at that moment, Romero goes even deeper into his journey of conversion, and he realizes that it's necessary to go beyond like a courtesy relationship with the church, with the government, and with the military. And he begins to perhaps to think not that he himself is going to take on the politics, but that as leader of the church, he's going to have to approach it differently. And I think he's moved to understand Rutilio's commitment and what that meant. There was a sister who was the superior of La Divina Providencia, which is the hospital campus where Romero lived and where he was killed, who said he was always a beautiful preacher and it was very spiritual. But then there came a time when he realized that to speak beautifully and just in a context of spirituality was not what was needed.
So what changes? From 1977, 1980, we now have the martyrdom of Óscar Romero. We will see during the period of the Civil War so many more being killed. The Civil War has lasted 30 years. Where is the church at the moment, and what's going on in society, Joaquin?
We're living in a very decisive moment in Salvadoran history, because the political system that was established after the peace accords, or as a result of the peace accords of 1992, has basically collapsed, right? Has collapsed, and now a new kind of political system is emerging. The moment is very significant in the sense that once again, a lot of the old questions come to the surface. Right? The situation of massive poverty in El Salvador remains more or less the same. Some say worse in a different form. Right? Massive migration, mainly to the United States, mostly because people don't find jobs. Social violence and crime is rampant, although some said that homicides have diminished in the past year or so. So the situation of the country is very complex. Right? So I think that precisely because of that, it's a moment of where Salvadoran society is expecting some kind of moral leadership on the part of religious leaders, different religious leaders, and I think that's, in my view, one of the fundamental challenges. What type of moral leadership, right, the religious leaders can provide to Salvadoran society at a moment like this?
Ana Maria?
I'm not in the country, so I don't see the day-to-day way that the church carries out their ministry and their mission. I would maybe want to step back and say that for Archbishop Romero, that night of Rutilio Grande's death, he makes a decisive decision with the council of others that were there, other lay ministers and priests and so forth. He decides that they're only going to have one mass in the entire country. And by doing that, he puts himself in tension with the papal representative, with other church leaders, because that has never been done. And then he refuses to be present at any government function. And that was the custom of the church, to always be at these government functions until there was clarity of who murdered Rutilio and his companions. And in my interviews with some of the young seminarians at the time, they talk about that time, and they said it was like a Pentecost moment where we felt enlivened by the Spirit of God, and we didn't even fear death, because we felt that this is what we were being called to do. And Rutilio's death put that spirit into us. And I think the church at that time is trying to make a move in that direction, but they're also realistically dealing with centuries of a certain way of being. And that carries it to the present moment. I think there's a lot of good efforts that have taken place. I know that some priest and leadership positions, to mention Father Andreu Oliva at the UCA, who's the president of the Central American University, has publicly spoken out against what's politically occurring in the country as part of the celebration of the UCA martyrs. And I thought to myself, isn't that what the UCA martyrs would want us to talk about? But it's very complex.
Ana Maria, Joaquin, you've reminded me that you're not in El Salvador right now. And so it's difficult for you to opine on especially what is going on in the church there at this time. But you are living in the United States for the most part, and you've been based here for some time. And we're living a particular reality in terms of church and state as well. What lessons do you think, or what primary lessons does the church and the people of El Salvador have for us living in the polarized nation that we're in now?
That's a major question. Perhaps as with all religious institutions, there is this ebb and flow of how we respond to the world around us. And there's moments of great inspiration, motivated by Second Vatican Council, by Medellin, by Puebla. And we try and venture off to do things that are important and necessary. And then I think with time, those structures begin to solidify in such a way that they don't free the spirit of the gospel, they contain it. And I'm afraid that in the United States, we might be at that moment where so much of what the church could be doing has been solidified and almost frozen in time, if you will. And we have to return to the spirit of the gospel. What are we all about? Or we have to be concerned over and over again about structures and what the church is asking and what the rules are and so forth? Or is it the spirit? Is it we have to be concerned for the most vulnerable? And the most vulnerable, we may think of in so many different ways, and we may question whether they follow church teaching. But what is church teaching all about? What does church teaching intend to do? It's to free us to be true sons and daughters of God and to be part of a global family. I guess I pray that the spirit of what's happening in El Salvador on Saturday will release that new moment, that new Pentecost, and we stop to think about what really matters. And is this what God really would ask of us? Is this what the gospel is asking of us and inviting us to consider?
As you say, this is a good moment, but also a good time in the church where we move towards this synodality and the synodal way that Pope Francis talks about, a listening church. Maybe if I can ask you, Joaquin, how do you see this moment and the lessons it has for us?
When I think about the period we've been discussing in this interview, the 1970s in El Salvador, I think about the fact that we live a time of prophets, right? People were called to offer spiritual guidance, moral leadership, and sometimes very concrete social leadership, or even political leadership in some cases, right? And I feel that in some ways, not only the Catholic Church, but religious institutions in the United States in general are facing a similar situation right now, where basically the very complex and difficult situation of the country, right, requires this kind, or actually poses that challenge, right, to be a prophetic voice in society in the sense of providing this moral and spiritual leadership, and to offer guidance, to promote tolerance, to help to society to heal.
Joaquin, you spoke about being at that mass, right, where Óscar Romero presided, speaking about Rutilio and his legacy. You spoke about that as a kind of conversion moment for you, at least a very significant moment in your own life. I just want to ask you very personally, what are you hoping for in this moment that we're about to witness with the beatification of Rutilio?
I deeply wish that the beatification we're going to witness on next Saturday, right, brings deep solace to Salvadorian societies and Salvadorians abroad and to the world in general, because we're living in a moment of deep pain for the world at large because of the pandemic, the fear that many people experience for many different reasons in many different parts of the world. And I think this kind of examples, right, the life of Rutilio is very much needed to really reflect the meaning of this deep love for humanity.
Ana Maria, you, unlike us, myself or Joaquin, are going to be there this Saturday of the beatification. What's going through your mind? You know, again, what are your hopes and dreams for the people of El Salvador and for the church?
It's rather an overwhelming experience to think about it. It's a moment of great affirmation, especially since these many decades, sometimes Rutilio's memory has not been kept in good stead. It's been tarnished by what people think has happened or didn't happen, accusations of political intrigue and everything else that you could possibly imagine. And so to say the church stops and acknowledges that this is a holy man, that this is what he did with his life, and at no thought of what it would cost, and the profound love he had for the people, that is like the most unbelievable gift to the church and to humanity, that you're not measured by where you're born and what you have or what you don't have. It's because you are a son and daughter of God. And I also stopped to think that Rutilio, coming from such humble beginnings, has such immense gifts and talents. If only others are given an opportunity, they can flourish as human beings. And we don't need to be living in such divisive times of poverty and conflicts and tensions.
Thank you. May their memory, the memory of Rutilio Grande, Nelson Lemus, and Manuel Solórzano, be for us witness and inspiration for the way we lead our lives. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Behind the Story today. Follow our coverage of the beatification of Rutilio Grande and his companions at americamagazine.org. Please also consider becoming a subscriber of America. Visit americamagazine.org/subscribe and hit the subscribe button here on YouTube.